The American Southwest in the mid-19th century was a land where violence was currency and death wore many faces. But among the countless outlaws, gunfighters, and desperados who carved their names into the blood-soaked history of the frontier, one group stands apart not for their heroism, but for their absolute descent into darkness. This is the story of the Glanton Gang, a collection of scalp hunters whose crimes were so horrific, so systematic, and so utterly without conscience that they would inspire one of the greatest and most disturbing works of American literature. These were not the romanticized outlaws of dime novels and Hollywood westerns. These were professional killers who operated under government contracts, men who transformed murder into a business model and genocide into a paying proposition. In the scorching deserts of Mexico and the lawless territories of the American frontier, John Joel Glanton assembled around him a diverse collection of the most violent and desperate men of his era. Sonorans, Cherokee and Delaware Indians, French Canadians, Texans, Irishmen, a Negro, and a full-blooded Comanche. What united them was not patriotism or even common cause, but rather an insatiable appetite for violence and the promise of easy money earned through the systematic slaughter of human beings. They would become the most notorious scalp hunting gang in the history of the American West, leaving a trail of mutilated corpses and devastated communities across thousands of miles of frontier wilderness. The year was 1849, and the Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua faced a desperate situation. Apache raids had terrorized the northern territories for decades, leaving entire settlements abandoned and forcing the Mexican government to consider the most extreme measures. In their desperation, these states implemented bounty programs that would attract the worst elements of frontier society. They offered 200 pesos for the scalp of an adult Apache male, 150 pesos for women and children. In today's money, that's roughly $8,000 per scalp. It was more than most men could earn in years of honest labor, and it would prove to be an irresistible lure for those willing to commit the most unspeakable acts in pursuit of profit. Into this powder keg of violence and opportunity stepped John Joel Glanton, a man whose personal history read like a catalog of frontier brutality. Born in Edgefield County, South Carolina in 1819, Glanton had experienced more violence by his 20th birthday than most men would witness in a lifetime. His father died when he was young, forcing the family to relocate first to Louisiana and then to Arkansas, where his mother remarried a plantation owner. But it was in Texas where Glanton's true nature would be forged in blood and tragedy. The defining moment of Glanton's life came in 1835 when he was just 16 years old. His fiancée was abducted, scalped, and murdered by Lipan Apaches, an act of violence that would transform what might have been ordinary frontier hatred into something far more pathological and consuming. This personal tragedy planted the seeds of a vendetta that would eventually metastasize into indiscriminate slaughter on an industrial scale. From that moment forward, Glanton viewed all Native Americans not as human beings with individual identities and moral worth, but as targets for extermination regardless of tribe, age, or innocence. By the time he was commissioned as a captain in the Texas Rangers at the impossibly young age of 16, Glanton had already established himself as someone capable of extreme violence in service of his goals. He served with distinction during the Texas Revolution, narrowly escaping the massacre at Goliad, where hundreds of Texan prisoners were executed by Mexican forces. Later, during the Mexican-American War, he fought with John Coffee Hayes' Regiment of Texas Mounted Rifles, where his commanding officers noted his extraordinary activity and daring in combat. But even during his military service, Glanton's violent tendencies manifested in ways that troubled his superiors. In 1847, while serving in Mexico, Glanton killed a Mexican civilian in the city of Magdalena. Although he claimed self-defense, witnesses disputed his account, and military police were sent to arrest him. Rather than face justice, Glanton fled, beginning a pattern of violence followed by escape that would characterize the remainder of his criminal career. This incident marked a crucial turning point where Glanton began operating entirely outside the bounds of military discipline while still maintaining connections within the ranger and military communities that would prove essential to his later enterprises. When the Mexican-American War ended in 1848, Glanton returned to San Antonio, but civilian life held no appeal for a man whose entire adult existence had been defined by violence and conflict. Leaving behind his wife and children, he organized an expedition to the California gold fields, taking a circuitous route through Mexico that would change the course of his life forever. When his party became stranded in Chihuahua, Glanton discovered an opportunity that would prove far more lucrative than gold mining and perfectly suited to his particular talents and obsessions. The state of Chihuahua, desperate to find a solution to their Apache problem, had recently passed legislation offering bounties for Apache scalps. Glanton, with his military experience, his pathological hatred of Native Americans, and his complete lack of moral constraints, was the perfect candidate for this government-sanctioned program of ethnic cleansing. Working with Michael Chevalier, an American businessman, Glanton influenced the Chihuahuan legislature to pass the Fifth Law, which formalized the scalp bounty system and provided legal cover for what would become systematic genocide. By the summer of 1849, Glanton had secured his first contract as a government bounty hunter, financed by Benjamin Riddle, the United States consul. This official backing provided him with the resources and legal protection necessary to begin operations on a scale that individual scalp hunters could never achieve. His early campaigns were immediately successful, bringing in dozens of Apache scalps and generating substantial profits for both Glanton and his growing band of followers. The success of these initial operations attracted men from across the frontier, drawn by the promise of easy money and unlimited violence. The gang that coalesced around Glanton represented a cross-section of frontier society's most desperate and violent elements. There were former soldiers seeking the adrenaline and camaraderie of combat, drifters and outcasts looking for belonging and purpose, Native Americans who had been displaced from their own tribes, and simply men who had discovered they possessed a talent for killing and wanted to profit from it. Among these recruits was a figure who would become legendary in American literature, though his historical existence remains disputed. According to Samuel Chamberlain, a soldier who claimed to have ridden with the gang, Glanton's second-in-command was an enormous, hairless man known as Judge Holden. Chamberlain described him as standing 6 feet 6 inches tall, with a massive frame, a pale, expressionless face completely devoid of hair, and an intellect that encompassed geology, mineralogy, languages, and music. Most disturbing was Chamberlain's assessment that Judge Holden was a cooler-blooded villain than had ever gone unhung, a man who combined vast learning with predatory instincts and an utter absence of moral feeling. Whether Judge Holden actually existed or was a creation of Chamberlain's imagination, his presence in the narrative of the Glanton gang represents something crucial about the nature of their enterprise. This was not simply random violence committed by ignorant, brutal men. Instead, it was systematic, calculated evil that combined intellectual sophistication with absolute moral depravity. The gang operated with the efficiency and organization that suggested careful planning and philosophical justification for their actions. As 1849 progressed, the Glanton gang's operations expanded in both scope and brutality. They ranged across thousands of square miles of desert and mountain terrain, tracking Apache bands to their most remote hideouts and leaving no survivors. Their methods were ruthlessly efficient. They would attack at dawn when their victims were most vulnerable, kill every man, woman, and child they could find, and then scalp the dead for presentation to Mexican authorities as proof of their success. But the very success of the scalp bounty system contained the seeds of its own corruption. As Apache populations declined under the intense pressure from Glanton and other bounty hunters, it became increasingly difficult to find legitimate targets. The surviving Apaches had learned to avoid the hunting parties, taking refuge in areas so remote and well-defended that even experienced trackers like Glanton's men struggled to locate them. Faced with declining profits and growing expenses, the gang began to look for easier targets. The transition from hunting Apache warriors to attacking peaceful agricultural Indians marked the beginning of the Glanton gang's descent from government-sanctioned violence into pure criminality. They began raiding settlements of peaceful Native Americans who had never participated in attacks on Mexican communities, scalping farmers and their families who posed no threat to anyone. When questioned by Mexican authorities about the legitimacy of these scalps, Glanton and his men claimed they came from hostile Apaches. After all, they reasoned, one scalp looked much like another, and the bounty system provided no mechanism for verification. This logic led inevitably to the next horrific escalation. If Apache's scalps could not be distinguished from those of peaceful Indians, then they could not be distinguished from the scalps of Mexican peasants either. By early 1850, the Glanton gang had begun systematically murdering Mexican citizens, particularly those who lived in remote areas where their disappearances would not be immediately noticed. They targeted the poor, the isolated, and the defenseless, killing entire families and presenting their scalps to authorities as evidence of successful Apache hunting. The profits from this expanded operation were enormous. In 1849 alone, the state of Chihuahua paid out the equivalent of over $600,000 in today's money for scalp bounties. Glanton's share of this blood money made him one of the wealthiest men on the frontier, with resources that allowed him to expand his operations and attract even more followers to his cause. But the Mexican authorities were not entirely naive, and reports began to circulate about the suspicious nature of some of the scalps being presented for bounty. When officials in Chihuahua finally realized that Glanton was murdering Mexican citizens, they moved quickly to terminate his contract and declare him an outlaw. Governor Angel Trias Alvarez placed a bounty on Glanton's head equivalent to nearly $270,000 in today's money, transforming the hunter into the hunted. Rather than disbanding or seeking legitimate employment, the gang simply moved their operations to the neighboring state of Sonora, where desperate officials were willing to overlook their reputation in exchange for results against the Apache threat. But the pattern repeated itself with depressing predictability. Initial success hunting legitimate Apache targets gave way to attacks on peaceful Indians, which in turn escalated to the murder of Mexican civilians. Within months, the gang had worn out their welcome in Sonora as well, and were forced to flee north into Arizona territory. It was at this point that the Glanton gang discovered what would become their final and most profitable criminal enterprise. L. Lincoln, a relative of the future president, who had established a ferry service to transport California gold rush migrants across the river. Lincoln's operation was enormously successful, ferrying over 20,000 immigrants and generating profits of over $60,000 in just a few months. Glanton immediately recognized the potential of this strategic location. The ferry represented a choke point through which thousands of travelers had to pass, most carrying substantial amounts of gold and supplies. Unlike Apache hunting, which required extensive travel and carried significant risks, controlling the ferry would provide a steady stream of victims who came directly to them. The gang quickly moved to take control of the operation, driving Lincoln away and establishing themselves as the new proprietors of the crossing. Under Glanton's management, the ferry became a death trap for unwary travelers. The gang charged exorbitant fees, sometimes 10 times what Lincoln had collected, and frequently robbed and murdered their customers after transporting them across the river. Passengers returning from the California gold fields, loaded with gold dust and nuggets, were particular targets. The gang would ferry them to the middle of the river, kill them, dump their bodies into the Colorado, and divide their possessions. The strategic importance of the Yuma crossing meant that the gang's control of the ferry brought them into conflict with the local Quechan Indians, who had traditionally controlled river crossings in the area and operated their own competing ferry service. Rather than negotiating or sharing the profits, Glanton chose to eliminate the competition through violence. The gang destroyed the Quechan ferry and killed several tribal members, actions that would ultimately prove to be fatal mistakes. The Quechan, unlike the Mexican authorities or the scattered Apache bands the gang had previously terrorized, represented a unified, organized force capable of coordinated retaliation. They had detailed knowledge of the local terrain, established alliances with neighboring tribes, And most importantly, they had been pushed beyond the point where further accommodation was possible. The Glanton gang's casual brutality had finally brought them into conflict with an enemy capable of matching their violence with superior numbers and tactical advantage. The end, when it came, was swift and absolute. On April 23, 1850, the Quechan launched a coordinated attack on the ferry operation, catching the gang completely off guard. In the battle that followed, John Joel Glanton was killed along with most of his followers. Those who survived the initial assault were hunted down and eliminated over the following days. The reign of terror that had lasted for over 2 years and claimed hundreds of innocent lives was finally brought to an end by the very people the gang had assumed they could brutalize with impunity. The death of the Glanton gang marked the end of one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American history, but their legacy would endure in ways their victims could never have imagined. The story of their crimes, preserved in Samuel Chamberlain's memoir and later immortalized in Cormac McCarthy's novel Blood Meridian, would serve as a permanent reminder of the depths to which human beings can sink when violence becomes normalized and profit provides justification for any atrocity. More than simply a tale of frontier violence, the story of the Glanton gang reveals the dark possibilities inherent in any system that places economic incentives on human death. The bounty programs that created them were implemented by legitimate governments facing genuine security threats, but the logic of the market inevitably led to the commodification of human life and the systematic targeting of the most vulnerable populations. The Mexican state's bounty system had unleashed something far more sinister than anyone anticipated. What began as desperate government policy to combat Apache raids had evolved into a systematic enterprise of human slaughter driven by pure profit. By 1850, the Glanton gang had transformed from government contractors into something unprecedented in American criminal history, a multinational corporation of death operating across 2 countries with impunity. The gang's composition reflected this international scope of operations. According to Samuel Chamberlain's detailed memoir, their ranks included Americans, Mexicans, Native Americans from multiple tribes, freed slaves, Irish immigrants, and French-Canadian trappers. This diversity wasn't accidental but strategic. Each member brought specialized skills essential to their murderous enterprise. The Cherokee and Delaware members provided unmatched tracking abilities and intimate knowledge of Apache territory. The Mexican members offered crucial local connections, language skills, and understanding of regional politics. The Americans contributed military training from the recent war and connections to official bounty programs. But it was the leadership structure that made the gang truly formidable. John Joel Glanton commanded through a combination of charisma, tactical brilliance, and absolutely ruthless violence. His lieutenants managed specific aspects of their operation like a legitimate business enterprise. They maintained detailed financial records, established supply chains for weapons and provisions, developed intelligence networks to identify targets, and created systematic methods for processing and selling scalps to maximize profits. The scalp trade itself had become horrifyingly efficient. The gang maintained relationships with corrupt officials in both Sonora and Chihuahua, who would verify scalps and authorize payments without asking uncomfortable questions about their origins. They established regular routes between hunting grounds and government offices, timing their deliveries to coincide with monthly bounty payments. Most disturbing was their development of preservation techniques that allowed scalps to remain fresh-looking for weeks, enabling them to stockpile their gruesome inventory and sell in bulk quantities. Samuel Chamberlain's account provides chilling details about their methods. The gang would approach Apache camps under cover of darkness, surrounding them completely before launching coordinated attacks designed to prevent any escape. They used specific weapons chosen not for military effectiveness but for maximizing scalp collection, tomahawks and scalping knives rather than rifles that might damage their valuable merchandise. The attacks were planned with the precision of military operations, with designated roles for each member and predetermined escape routes mapped in advance. The psychological transformation of gang members under this system was profound. Chamberlain described how men who had initially joined seeking adventure or quick money gradually became desensitized to extreme violence through a process of incremental brutalization. The first scalping was traumatic for most members, but the substantial payment and group pressure to participate created a cycle where each subsequent killing became easier. Within months, Chamberlain observed, new recruits would be competing to take the most scalps, driven by both financial incentives and twisted pride in their efficiency. The gang's relationship with legitimate society remained complex throughout this period. They maintained business relationships with merchants in major southwestern towns who supplied them with weapons, ammunition, and provisions. These merchants either willfully ignored the source of the gang's wealth or convinced themselves that supporting Apache hunters served the greater good of frontier security. Some respectable citizens even invested in the gang's operations, providing upfront capital in exchange for shares of bounty payments. Judge Holden emerged as perhaps the most disturbing figure in this enterprise of systematic murder. Chamberlain's descriptions paint him as a man of enormous physical presence, combined with sophisticated education and complete moral vacancy. Standing over 6 feet tall with a completely hairless, pale appearance that many found deeply unsettling, Holden possessed extensive knowledge of geology, languages, military tactics, and human anatomy. He maintained detailed journals documenting not just their financial transactions, but also anthropological observations about the various tribes they encountered and killed. Holden's influence over the gang extended beyond his role as Glanton's second-in-command. He served as their intellectual architect, developing philosophical justifications for their actions that helped members rationalize their participation in mass murder. He argued that they were agents of historical progress, clearing the way for civilization's advance through the necessary elimination of primitive peoples. This pseudo-intellectual framework provided psychological comfort to gang members who might otherwise have been troubled by their actions. The judge's educational background enabled him to maintain correspondence with academics and government officials in the United States, presenting himself as a frontier researcher studying Native American cultures. Through these connections, he arranged for the sale of cultural artifacts looted from destroyed Apache camps to museums and private collectors back east. This secondary revenue stream proved quite profitable while also providing the gang with a veneer of scientific respectability. As 1849 progressed, the gang's operations expanded in both scope and brutality. Mexico border, creating forward operating bases that allowed them to range deeper into Apache territory. These camps were fortified positions with weapons caches, supply stores, and holding areas for captives who might be sold into slavery rather than killed for their scalps. The decision between scalping and enslaving captives was made purely on economic grounds, with young women and children often being more valuable alive than dead. The gang's intelligence network grew increasingly sophisticated. They cultivated relationships with traders, soldiers, and settlers throughout the region who would provide information about Apache movements in exchange for protection or financial compensation. This network allowed them to anticipate Apache raids and position themselves to intercept returning war parties laden with stolen goods and captives. They also began targeting peaceful Apache bands during seasonal gatherings, timing their attacks to maximize casualties and scalp collection. The transition from hunting hostile Apaches to targeting peaceful tribes marked a crucial escalation in the gang's criminal evolution. Initially, they could justify their actions as legitimate military operations against enemy combatants. But as Apache populations declined and survivors became more elusive, the gang faced a choice between reduced profits and expanded targeting. They chose expansion, beginning to attack Apache groups that had established peaceful relationships with Mexican settlements and even Apache individuals who were living integrated lives in Mexican communities. This expansion revealed the purely mercenary nature of their enterprise. The gang maintained detailed intelligence on which Apache bands were hostile, which were peaceful, and which had negotiated treaties with Mexican authorities. Yet they attacked all indiscriminately, driven entirely by the financial value of scalps rather than any legitimate military or security objectives. Peaceful Apaches were actually preferred targets because they were less likely to be heavily armed or positioned defensively. The Mexican government's initial satisfaction with the gang's effectiveness gradually gave way to growing unease about their methods and autonomy. Reports began reaching state capitals about attacks on peaceful tribes and even Mexican citizens who were mistaken for Apaches or simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some officials attempted to impose greater oversight on scalp hunting operations, but the gang had become too powerful and too profitable for meaningful control. Governor Angel Trias of Chihuahua began receiving reports that deeply troubled him about the activities of his contracted scalp hunters. Mexican military officers complained that the gang was operating with complete independence, ignoring official requests for coordination and sometimes interfering with legitimate military operations. Civilian officials in border communities reported that the gang's presence was creating more problems than it solved, as their violent reputation was attracting retaliation from Apache groups that had previously left Mexican settlements alone. Most seriously, evidence began accumulating that the gang was not limiting their scalp collection to Apache victims. The physical characteristics that supposedly identified Apache scalps were shared by many Mexican citizens, particularly those of indigenous ancestry. Rumors spread that the gang was supplementing their Apache hunting with opportunistic murders of Mexican travelers, isolated families, and anyone else whose death might go unnoticed and whose scalp could be passed off as Apache. The Glanton gang had evolved from a quasi-legitimate military contractor into something entirely new in American criminal history, an international criminal organization that combined systematic genocide with sophisticated business operations. Their success had created a template that would inspire imitators throughout the frontier region, spreading their model of commercialized violence across the American Southwest. The Mexican government's loss of control over their contracted killers demonstrated the dangers of attempting to privatize warfare and the inevitable corruption that results when financial incentives are applied to human slaughter. As 1850 approached, the gang stood at the height of their power and influence. They controlled vast territories along the border, commanded fear and respect from both Mexican officials and American settlers, and had accumulated wealth that rivaled legitimate businesses. By the spring of 1850, the Glanton gang had evolved into something far more sinister than even the most brutal scalp hunters of their era. What had begun as government-sanctioned Apache hunting had transformed into systematic terrorism against anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. The gang's control of the Yuma Crossing ferry represented the apex of their criminal enterprise, but it would also mark the beginning of their downfall. The ferry operation provided the gang with a steady stream of victims and an ideal choke point for their predatory activities. Gold seekers returning from California often carried substantial sums, making them attractive targets for robbery and murder. The gang's method was brutally efficient. They would quote exorbitant fees for passage, sometimes 10 times the normal rate, and those who couldn't pay or protested too vigorously simply disappeared. Bodies were dumped in the Colorado River or buried in the desert, their possessions divided among gang members. But the Glanton gang's appetite for violence extended far beyond simple robbery. They had developed a taste for killing that went well beyond financial motivation. Samuel Chamberlain's memoir describes incidents where the gang would murder passengers purely for entertainment, betting on how long victims could survive various tortures, or competing to see who could inflict the most creative forms of suffering. The ferry crossing became a hunting ground where human life held no value whatsoever. The gang's relationship with the Quechan tribe, who controlled the traditional crossing points along the Colorado River, had been deteriorating for months. The Quechan, also known as the Yuma Indians, had operated ferries and provided crossing assistance to travelers for generations. They viewed the white settlers' presence as an intrusion, but had generally maintained peaceful relations through trade and cooperation. Glanton's seizure of Lincoln's Ferry and his gang's increasingly violent behavior toward both whites and Indians began to strain these relationships to the breaking point. The Quechan were not naive about frontier violence. They had dealt with aggressive traders, hostile military expeditions, and territorial disputes for decades. But the Glanton gang represented something different entirely. These were not soldiers following orders or settlers defending their families. These were men who killed for pleasure, who showed no respect for any form of human dignity, and who seemed to view violence as an end in itself rather than a means to achieve specific goals. The breaking point came in early April 1850, when members of the Glanton gang destroyed a Quechan ferry located downriver from their own operation. Not content with eliminating competition, they murdered the Quechan operators and mutilated their bodies in ways that violated every cultural taboo. The message was clear. The gang would tolerate no challenge to their control of the river crossing, regardless of prior agreements or traditional rights. Judge Holden's role in escalating tensions with the Quechan cannot be understated. According to Chamberlain's account, Holden took particular pleasure in psychological warfare against the tribe. He would display scalps taken from peaceful Apache bands, claiming they belonged to Quechan warriors killed in battle. He spread rumors that the Quechan were planning attacks on white settlers, attempting to provoke military intervention that would eliminate the tribe entirely. Most disturbing were reports that Holden had begun collecting Quechan children, claiming they were being taken for education, but actually subjecting them to the same horrors the gang inflicted on adult victims. The Quechan leadership, recognizing that peaceful coexistence was no longer possible, began planning their response. Unlike the scattered Apache bands that had fallen victim to the scalp hunters, the Quechan were organized, unified, and fighting on familiar terrain. They had detailed knowledge of the gang's routines, weaknesses, and the layout of their riverside compound. Most importantly, they understood that this was not merely a territorial dispute, but a struggle for survival. Chief Caballo and Pelo, whose name meant horse with no hair, emerged as the leader of the Quechan resistance. A veteran of numerous conflicts with Mexican forces and American military expeditions, he possessed both the tactical knowledge and moral authority necessary to unite his people against the gang. His decision to move against the Glanton gang was not made lightly. The Quechan understood that attacking white settlers, even criminals like the gang members, would likely bring military retaliation against their entire community. The gang, meanwhile, had grown complacent in their dominance. Success had made them careless. They had operated with impunity for so long that they believed themselves untouchable. Glanton himself had grown increasingly erratic, his violent outbursts now directed at his own men as often as at victims. Several gang members had been killed on his orders for minor infractions or perceived slights. The group's cohesion was breaking down as paranoia and brutality consumed their leader. On the morning of April 23, 1850, approximately 100 Quechan warriors surrounded the ferry compound at dawn. The attack was swift, coordinated, and merciless. The gang members, many still drunk from the previous night's celebrations, were caught completely off guard. Unlike their usual victims, the Quechan were experienced fighters who showed no mercy to men who had shown none to others. John Joel Glanton died in the initial assault, struck down by war clubs as he stumbled from his quarters. His death was neither heroic nor dignified. The man who had terrorized the borderlands for years was killed like any common criminal, his body left to rot in the desert sun. Judge Holden's fate remains unclear from the historical record. Some accounts suggest he was killed alongside Glanton, while others claim he escaped in the chaos. The uncertainty surrounding his death would contribute to his later mythological status in American literature. The few gang members who survived the initial attack fled into the desert, most dying of thirst and exposure before reaching civilization. Those who did survive carried news of the gang's destruction back to settlements throughout the Southwest. The reign of terror that had lasted over a year was finally over, ended by the very people the gang had so brutally oppressed. The Quechan victory was complete but costly. As Caballo and Pelo had predicted, military retaliation followed swiftly. Within months, American forces had established a permanent presence in the region, ostensibly to protect travelers but actually to assert control over Quechan territory. The tribe's traditional way of life was forever altered, their independence sacrificed to rid the world of the Glanton gang's evil. The destruction of the Glanton gang marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in the history of the American frontier. Their story serves as a reminder of how quickly civilization can collapse when economic incentives reward brutality and when authority figures abandon their moral responsibilities. The bounty system that created the gang was eventually abandoned by Mexican authorities, but not before hundreds of innocent people had died and entire communities had been terrorized. In the decades that followed, the Glanton gang's legacy would be remembered primarily through Samuel Chamberlain's memoir, and later through Cormac McCarthy's literary masterpiece, Blood Meridian. These accounts, while differing in their details and reliability, captured the essential horror of what happened when men abandoned all moral constraints in pursuit of profit and violence. The gang's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked brutality and the importance of maintaining ethical boundaries even in the harsh realities of frontier life. The Colorado River crossing where the gang met their end became a symbol of justice finally served. Travelers passing through the area in later years would often pause to reflect on the events that had transpired there, grateful that such monsters no longer stalked the borderlands. As the Glanton gang's operations expanded across multiple territories and their methods grew increasingly sophisticated, the true scope of their criminal enterprise began to reveal itself through a network of connections that stretched far beyond the dusty borderlands of Mexico and Arizona. What emerged was not simply a band of opportunistic killers, but a complex organization that had successfully infiltrated legitimate business, government contracts, and even international trade relationships. The gang's financial operations were far more intricate than initial investigations had suggested. Beyond the obvious bounty payments from Mexican state governments, they had established what amounted to a diversified criminal portfolio. They operated protection rackets along major trade routes, demanding payment from merchant caravans traveling between Texas and California. They had secured exclusive contracts to supply certain goods to remote military outposts, using their reputation for violence to eliminate competition. Most significantly, they had developed relationships with corrupt officials on both sides of the border, who facilitated their operations in exchange for substantial bribes. Judge Holden, if Samuel Chamberlain's accounts are to be believed, served as the intellectual architect of these expanded operations. His education and linguistic abilities made him invaluable in negotiating contracts and managing the gang's increasingly complex financial arrangements. Chamberlain described him as keeping meticulous records of all transactions, maintaining detailed maps of territorial boundaries and jurisdictional limitations, and even conducting what amounted to market research on the most profitable locations for their various criminal enterprises. The judge's role extended beyond mere administrative functions. According to Chamberlain, he had developed an almost scientific approach to violence, studying the most effective methods for extracting information, the optimal techniques for intimidating potential witnesses, and the psychological principles that could be used to maintain control over both gang members and victims. He reportedly kept extensive notes on human behavior under extreme stress, documenting reactions to different types of threats and physical abuse, with the detached curiosity of a natural philosopher conducting experiments. This intellectual approach to brutality made the gang far more dangerous than typical frontier outlaws. Where other criminal groups relied on impulsive violence and crude intimidation, the Glanton gang operated with calculated precision. They understood the legal boundaries between different territories and jurisdictions, exploiting gaps in law enforcement coverage to maximum advantage. They studied the seasonal patterns of trade and migration, timing their operations to coincide with periods when their victims would be most vulnerable and isolated. The gang's recruitment methods also reflected this systematic approach. Rather than simply accepting any desperate man willing to join their ranks, they actively sought individuals with specific skills that would enhance their operations. They recruited former soldiers for their combat experience, ex-lawmen for their knowledge of legal procedures, merchants for their understanding of trade routes and market values, and even clerks and accountants for their record-keeping abilities. Michael Chevalier, the American entrepreneur who had initially helped Glanton secure scalp hunting contracts in Chihuahua, represented another crucial element of the gang's operations. Chevalier served as their liaison with legitimate business interests, using his reputation as a respectable businessman to secure contracts and establish relationships that the gang could later exploit. He provided them with intelligence about valuable cargo shipments, introduced them to corrupt officials who could be bribed or intimidated, and helped them launder their ill-gotten gains through seemingly legitimate business transactions. The relationship between Chevalier and the gang illustrated the blurred lines between legal and illegal enterprise on the frontier. Many ostensibly legitimate businessmen found it profitable to maintain relationships with violent men who could solve problems that conventional legal remedies could not address. Chevalier's involvement suggests that the Glanton gang's operations were not entirely separate from the legitimate economy, but were instead integrated into it in ways that made their criminal activities more sustainable and more difficult to prosecute. The gang's expansion into the ferry operation at Yuma Crossing represented the culmination of their evolution from simple bounty hunters to sophisticated criminal entrepreneurs. The ferry was not merely a source of revenue from passenger fees, but served as a strategic choke point that gave them access to intelligence about westward migration patterns, allowed them to identify wealthy travelers carrying gold from California, and provided them with a legitimate cover for their presence in the area. Their control of the ferry also demonstrated their understanding of infrastructure and economic leverage. By controlling a crucial transportation link, they could influence the flow of people and goods across a vast region. They could delay or expedite travel based on their own interests, extract information from passengers about conditions in California and elsewhere, and even manipulate market conditions by controlling the movement of trade goods. The systematic nature of their ferry operations was particularly chilling. Rather than simply robbing random passengers, they developed a careful selection process for identifying the most profitable victims. They would engage travelers in seemingly casual conversation to assess their wealth, determine whether they had family or associates who might investigate their disappearance, and evaluate their potential usefulness as sources of information about other opportunities. Passengers who were deemed too dangerous to rob or whose disappearance might attract unwanted attention were allowed to cross safely, sometimes even receiving courteous treatment that would encourage them to recommend the ferry to others. This selective approach allowed the gang to maintain a facade of legitimate business while systematically murdering and robbing those they identified as suitable targets. The psychological impact of their operations extended far beyond their immediate victims. The knowledge that travel through their territory involved potentially deadly risks created a climate of fear that affected trade, migration, and communication across the entire region. Some travelers began avoiding the area entirely, while others traveled in larger, more heavily armed groups that were expensive to organize and slower to move. This broader impact on regional commerce and development was perhaps one of the most significant long-term consequences of the gang's activities. By making travel and trade more dangerous and expensive, they contributed to the isolation of frontier communities and slowed the economic development of the entire Southwest. Their actions represented not just individual crimes, but a form of terrorism that threatened the stability of the entire frontier economy. The gang's relationship with local Native American tribes was equally complex and brutal. While they had initially been contracted to fight hostile Apache bands, their indiscriminate killing had created new enemies among previously neutral or friendly tribes. Their practice of taking Mexican scalps while claiming they were Apache had not only defrauded the Mexican government, but had also intensified conflicts between Mexican authorities and Apache groups who were blamed for attacks they had not committed. This manipulation of ethnic and national conflicts for profit demonstrated the gang's complete disregard for the broader consequences of their actions. They were willing to provoke wars, destroy communities, and destabilize entire regions if doing so served their immediate financial interests. Their activities contributed to a cycle of violence and retaliation that would continue long after their own destruction. The Quechan tribe's decision to attack the gang at Yuma Crossing was not a spontaneous act of violence, but rather a calculated response to sustained provocation. The Quechan had initially attempted to coexist with the ferry operation, even competing with it by operating their own crossing service. However, the gang's attacks on Quechan ferrymen and their systematic abuse of Native American passengers had made peaceful coexistence impossible. The tribal council's deliberations before the attack as later recounted by Quechan survivors, revealed a sophisticated understanding of the gang's operations and capabilities. They had observed the gang's routines, identified their weapons and defensive positions, and planned their assault to maximize the element of surprise while minimizing their own casualties. The success of their attack demonstrated that even the most brutal and well-armed criminal organization remained vulnerable to determined and well-organized resistance. The destruction of the Glanton gang at Yuma Crossing marked the end of one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American frontier history. Their legacy, however, extended far beyond their immediate crimes. They had demonstrated how violence could be systematized and commercialized, how legitimate institutions could be corrupted and exploited, and how individual criminality could escalate into organized terrorism that threatened entire regions. Their story serves as a dark reminder of the potential for human evil when moral constraints are abandoned in pursuit of profit and power. The combination of government sanction, economic incentive, and individual brutality that characterized their operations created a perfect storm of violence that left hundreds dead and entire communities traumatized. Looking at the abandoned ferry operation at Yuma Crossing, we find ourselves witnessing the final act of one of the most brutal criminal enterprises in American frontier history. The Glanton gang had transformed from government-sanctioned scalp hunters into operators of what was essentially a murder factory, disguised as a legitimate business. But their reign of terror was about to meet its end in the most fitting way possible, through the resistance of the very people they had brutalized. The Quechan tribe, known to Americans as the Yuma Indians, had occupied the Colorado River crossing for generations before white settlers arrived. This strategic location had made them wealthy and powerful, as they controlled one of the few reliable river crossings in hundreds of miles of desert territory. L. Lincoln first established his ferry operation. He had negotiated respectfully with the Quechan leadership, paying them for the right to operate on their traditional lands. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. Lincoln profited from the ferry, while the Quechan received payment and maintained their sovereignty over the crossing. Glanton's violent takeover of the ferry operation shattered this delicate balance. Unlike Lincoln, who had treated the Quechan as legitimate partners, Glanton viewed them as obstacles to be eliminated. His gang began systematically attacking Quechan ferries that operated nearby, destroying their boats and murdering their operators. In one particularly brutal incident, Glanton's men killed 11 Quechan ferry operators near Pilot Knob, leaving their bodies displayed as a warning to others who might challenge their monopoly. The gang's treatment of ferry passengers revealed the depths of their depravity. What had once been a relatively safe and efficient crossing became a gauntlet of extortion, robbery, and murder. Travelers found themselves trapped between the desert and the river, with no choice but to pay whatever price Glanton demanded. Those who complained were beaten. Those who resisted were killed. Those returning from the California goldfields with pouches of gold dust often disappeared entirely, their bodies dumped in the river or buried in the desert. Dr. Langdon, a physician traveling from California to Missouri, later testified about his experience at the ferry in early 1850. He described seeing bloodstains on the ferry platform that Glanton's men made no effort to clean, and witnessing the gang rifling through the belongings of passengers while they crossed. Most disturbing was his account of hearing screams from a building near the ferry landing. Screams that the gang members ignored as though they were perfectly normal sounds. The Quechan leaders, led by Chief Caballo and Pilo, initially attempted diplomatic solutions to the crisis. They sent emissaries to Mexican authorities in Sonora and to American officials in California, seeking intervention against Glanton's gang. But the remote location of Yuma Crossing, combined with the chaotic political situation following the Mexican-American War, meant that no effective government response was forthcoming. The Quechan found themselves abandoned by both Mexican and American authorities, left to face the Glanton gang's terrorism alone. As spring turned to summer in 1850, the situation at Yuma Crossing became increasingly volatile. Glanton's men, emboldened by months of unchecked violence, began treating the ferry crossing as their personal kingdom. They built additional structures around the landing, creating what amounted to a fortified compound. The gang established a saloon where they sold rot-gut whiskey at inflated prices, a general store that charged exorbitant rates for basic supplies, and even a crude brothel staffed by women who had been kidnapped from passing wagon trains. The breaking point came in April 1850 when Glanton's gang committed an act so brazen and brutal that it finally galvanized the Quechan into decisive action. A family of German immigrants, the Österreichs, arrived at the ferry with their life savings, hoping to start a new life in California. The family consisted of Johann and Greta Österreich and their 3 young children. According to witnesses, Glanton personally oversaw the robbery of the family, taking not only their money but also their wagon and livestock. When Johann Österreich protested that the gang was taking everything they owned, leaving them stranded in the desert, Glanton's response was characteristic of his complete lack of humanity. He shot Johann Österreich in the head at point-blank range, then ordered his men to kill the rest of the family to eliminate witnesses. The children's screams could be heard across the river, reaching the Quechan village where Chief Caballo and Pelo was meeting with his war council. This massacre of an innocent family, including young children, represented a level of evil that even the violence-hardened frontier could not tolerate. More importantly, it demonstrated to the Quechan that Glanton's gang would never be satisfied with mere control of the ferry. They intended to eliminate anyone who might challenge their authority or serve as witnesses to their crimes. The Quechan realized that their own survival depended on destroying the gang before the gang destroyed them. Chief Caballo and Pelo was a man of considerable intelligence and military experience. He had fought against Mexican forces for decades, developing sophisticated tactics for warfare in the desert environment. Unlike many Native American leaders who faced American expansion, he understood that the Quechan's survival required adapting traditional warfare methods to deal with the unique threat posed by heavily armed criminals operating from a fortified position. The chief's strategy was brilliantly conceived and executed with surgical precision. Rather than launching a direct assault on the ferry compound, which would have resulted in heavy Quechan casualties, he devised a plan that would use the gang's own greed and arrogance against them. The Quechan would appear to accept the gang's dominance while secretly preparing for a coordinated attack that would eliminate the threat permanently. Throughout the summer of 1850, the Quechan maintained a facade of submission while conducting careful reconnaissance of the gang's routines and defenses. They noted that Glanton's men were often drunk, that they kept irregular watch schedules, and that their weapons, while numerous, were frequently poorly maintained. Most importantly, they observed that the gang had grown complacent, believing that their reputation for extreme violence had cowed all potential opposition. The Quechan also began gathering intelligence about the gang's criminal activities, documenting their murders and robberies not for legal purposes, but to understand the full scope of the threat they faced. They discovered that Glanton's gang had killed at least 47 people at the ferry crossing since taking control, and had robbed hundreds more. The evidence made it clear that negotiation or compromise was impossible. The gang had to be completely destroyed. As autumn approached, Chief Caballo and Pelo made the decision that would end the Glanton gang's reign of terror. He would lead his warriors in a surprise attack designed not merely to drive the gang away, but to annihilate them entirely. The chief understood that anything less than complete victory would result in eventual retaliation that could destroy his people. The attack was planned for dawn on April 23, 1850, when the gang would be at their most vulnerable after a night of drinking and debauchery. The Quechan had observed that this was when the gang's guard was at its lowest, with most members either unconscious from alcohol or suffering from hangovers that impaired their reflexes and judgment. On the night before the attack, Chief Caballo and Pelo addressed his warriors with words that would be remembered in Quechan oral tradition for generations. "Tomorrow we cleanse our land of the evil that has poisoned it. These men have shown no mercy to the innocent, so we shall show no mercy to them. We fight not just for ourselves, but for all the travelers they have murdered, all the families they have destroyed, and all the people they would kill if we allow them to continue." The attack began before dawn. as Quechan warriors moved silently through the desert darkness toward the ferry compound. They had studied the layout meticulously, knowing exactly where each building stood and which structures were most likely to contain gang members. The assault was coordinated with the precision of a military operation, with different groups of warriors assigned specific targets and objectives. The end came swiftly and decisively for the Glanton gang. Their reign of terror concluded by the very people they had brutalized and underestimated. By the time the gang reached the Colorado River in 1850, they had transformed from government-contracted scalp hunters into something far more sinister. The ferry operation at Yuma Crossing would become their final criminal enterprise, but it also marked the beginning of their downfall. L. Lincoln quickly devolved into outright theft, extortion, and systematic murder of the very travelers they were supposed to be helping. The Colorado River crossing represented one of the most critical bottlenecks on the California Gold Rush Trail. Thousands of prospectors, settlers, and merchants had to cross this treacherous waterway to reach the gold fields, making it an ideal location for criminal exploitation. Lincoln's Ferry had been a godsend for travelers, providing safe passage for reasonable fees. But when John Glanton arrived with his band of killers, everything changed. The takeover of Lincoln's operation wasn't subtle. Glanton simply decided that the profits were too substantial to share, and he had the manpower to take what he wanted. Lincoln, despite being a Mexican-American war veteran himself, was no match for a gang of seasoned killers who had spent years perfecting their craft of violence. The legitimate ferry operator was driven out, and the Glanton gang assumed control of what had been a vital service for westward migration. Under Glanton's management, the ferry became a death trap. The gang charged exorbitant fees, sometimes 10 times what Lincoln had requested, and travelers had little choice but to pay. Those who protested or appeared to be carrying significant wealth often simply disappeared during the crossing. The Colorado River was deep and fast-moving, making it easy to dispose of bodies while claiming they had been lost to accidental drowning. But the gang's greed and bloodthirst soon extended beyond simple robbery. They began systematically murdering passengers regardless of their wealth, apparently killing for the sheer pleasure of it. Mexican travelers were particularly targeted, continuing the gang's pattern of racial violence that had characterized their scalp hunting operations. American citizens weren't spared either, especially those returning from the gold fields with their earnings. Samuel Chamberlain, in his controversial memoir, described the ferry operation as a slaughterhouse disguised as a business. According to his account, the gang would wait until ferries were in the middle of the river before attacking passengers, making escape impossible. Bodies were weighted down and thrown overboard, while valuables were divided among the gang members. The ferry itself became a floating crime scene, with bloodstains that the gang made little effort to conceal. The gang's control of the crossing also brought them into direct conflict with the Quechan people, also known as the Yuma, who had traditionally controlled river crossings in the area. The Quechan had operated their own ferry service and viewed the Colorado River as part of their ancestral territory. Glanton's aggressive takeover and the violence that followed represented not just criminal activity but an invasion of tribal lands. The relationship between the gang and the Quechan deteriorated rapidly. Initial attempts at coexistence failed as Glanton's men proved incapable of respecting tribal authority or customs. The gang's racist attitudes, honed through years of scalp hunting, made any peaceful arrangement impossible. They viewed the Quechan as obstacles to be eliminated rather than neighbors to be negotiated with. The situation reached a breaking point when the gang destroyed a Quechan ferry operation downstream near Pilot Knob, killing several tribal members in the process. This wasn't simply business competition, but rather a deliberate act of aggression designed to eliminate any alternative river crossing options. By controlling all ferry services in the area, Glanton could maximize both his profits and his opportunities for violence. The gang's hubris at this point was remarkable. They had essentially declared war on both the Mexican government, which had placed bounties on their heads, and the indigenous peoples of the region. They were operating as a law unto themselves in one of the most remote and dangerous areas of the American frontier. Their success had made them overconfident, and they began to believe they were untouchable. Judge Holden, if Chamberlain's accounts are to be believed, played a crucial role in the ferry operations. His education and intelligence made him valuable for negotiating with authorities and managing the more complex aspects of their criminal enterprise. But his presence also added an element of calculated evil to what might otherwise have been simple banditry. The judge understood the strategic importance of controlling the river crossing and helped plan the systematic exploitation of travelers. The gang's operations at Yuma Crossing represented the culmination of their criminal evolution. They had progressed from individual acts of violence to government-sanctioned scalp hunting to organized terrorism and finally, to systematic murder for profit. Each phase had prepared them for the next, desensitizing them to violence while teaching them how to operate as an efficient criminal organization. But their success at the ferry also contained the seeds of their destruction. By alienating both Mexican authorities and local tribal peoples, they had created powerful enemies on all sides. Their violence had become so indiscriminate that they posed a threat to everyone in the region, making their elimination a priority for multiple groups who would normally have had little reason to cooperate. The Quechan, in particular, were formidable opponents. Unlike the scattered Apache bands the gang had hunted for bounties, the Quechan were a cohesive tribal nation with intimate knowledge of the local terrain. They had been fighting to defend their territory for generations and possessed both the military skills and the motivation necessary to challenge the gang's dominance. As 1850 progressed, reports of violence at the Yuma Crossing began to spread throughout California and the Arizona Territory. Travelers who had witnessed the gang's brutality but managed to escape carried tales of systematic murder and extortion. The ferry, which should have been a symbol of progress and westward expansion, had become synonymous with death and lawlessness. The gang's final phase of operations showed them at their most dangerous and most vulnerable. They had accumulated significant wealth through their various criminal enterprises, but they had also made enemies of virtually everyone in the region. Their isolation at the river crossing, which had initially been a strategic advantage, was becoming a trap. They were surrounded by hostile forces with nowhere to retreat. Mexican authorities continued to hunt them with increased determination, offering substantial bounties for their capture or killing. Territorial authorities to take action. Most importantly, the Quechan were organizing a response that would soon bring the gang's reign of terror to its violent end. The ferry operation represented everything wrong with the Glanton gang's approach to life on the frontier. They had taken a legitimate business that served an important public function and transformed it into an instrument of murder and extortion. Their complete disregard for human life, whether Mexican, American, or Native American, had finally created a coalition of enemies powerful enough to destroy them. By early 1850, the stage was set for the final confrontation that would end the Glanton gang's career of violence. Their control of the Yuma Crossing had made them rich, but it had also sealed their fate. The Quechan at Yuma Crossing weren't like other tribes the Glanton gang had terrorized. They had watched these scalp hunters for months, studying their patterns, their weaknesses, their routines. Unlike the scattered Apache bands or defenseless Mexican villages, the Quechan were a unified force with intimate knowledge of the Colorado River crossing and deep resentment toward anyone who threatened their ancestral territory. The ferry operation had become increasingly brazen under Glanton's control. L. Lincoln's relatively fair transportation service had devolved into a criminal enterprise that extorted desperate travelers and murdered those who carried enough gold to make killing worthwhile. The gang charged outrageous fees, sometimes forcing entire families to surrender their life savings just to cross the river. Those who couldn't pay were often left stranded in the desert, while those who paid too much were frequently robbed and killed once they reached the opposite shore. But the Quechan had their own relationship with the Colorado River crossing that stretched back generations. This wasn't just another piece of frontier territory to them, it was sacred ground, a place where their ancestors had controlled trade and passage for centuries. The arrival of American immigrants during the California Gold Rush had already disrupted their traditional way of life, but they had adapted by offering their own ferry services and trading with travelers. Glanton's takeover represented something far more threatening than simple economic competition. His gang didn't just control the ferry. They desecrated the entire area with their violence and brutality. Bodies of murdered travelers were often left unburied along the riverbank, creating what the Quechan saw as spiritual pollution of their homeland. The gang's casual disregard for human life and their treatment of the crossing as nothing more than a killing ground was an insult that demanded response. Chief Caballo and Pelo, whose name meant horsehair in Spanish, had been watching the situation develop with growing anger. He was a veteran leader who had dealt with Mexican authorities, American military expeditions, and various frontier criminals, but the Glanton gang represented a new level of systematic evil. Their operations weren't just criminal. They were an affront to everything the Quechan understood about proper conduct at the sacred crossing. The chief began organizing a coordinated response in early April 1850. Unlike the scattered resistance the gang had faced from other native groups, this would be a carefully planned military operation designed to eliminate the entire criminal enterprise in a single decisive strike. The Quechan had several advantages that previous victims had lacked. They knew the terrain intimately, they had superior numbers, and most importantly, they understood that half measures would be useless against men this dangerous. Intelligence gathering was crucial to their plan. Quechan scouts observed the gang's daily routines, noting when different members were present at the ferry, where they slept, how they stored their weapons, and what their security arrangements looked like. They identified the gang's weaknesses. Their arrogance had made them careless, their success had made them predictable, and their isolation at the river crossing meant they had no possibility of outside assistance. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. The Quechan would approach the ferry appearing to be ordinary travelers seeking passage, thereby getting close enough to launch a surprise attack before the gang could organize effective resistance. Multiple groups would strike simultaneously from different directions, preventing any gang members from escaping into the desert where they might regroup or flee to safety elsewhere. On the morning of April 23, 1850, approximately 50 Quechan warriors began moving into position around the ferry crossing. They had spent days preparing for this moment, sharpening weapons, conducting final reconnaissance, and performing the spiritual ceremonies necessary before engaging in warfare. This wasn't just a military operation for them. It was a cleansing action designed to purify their homeland of the evil that had taken root there. The gang members present that morning included Glanton himself, along with approximately a dozen of his most trusted followers. Samuel Chamberlain, whose memoir would later provide the primary account of the gang's activities, had left the group several days earlier, possibly sensing that their luck was running out. Judge Holden, if he existed as Chamberlain described, was also absent from the ferry on that fatal morning. The attack began just after sunrise when the first group of Quechan approached the ferry requesting passage. Glanton, always suspicious but dulled by months of easy success, agreed to transport them across the river. As the ferry reached the middle of the Colorado, additional Quechan warriors emerged from concealment on both sides of the crossing, surrounding the entire operation. The battle was swift and decisive. The gang members, caught completely off guard and outnumbered nearly 4-1, had no opportunity to mount an organized defense. Their superior firearms meant little in close combat against determined warriors who had planned every aspect of the engagement. Within minutes, John Joel Glanton lay dead on the deck of his stolen ferry, his skull crushed by a Quechan war club. The systematic elimination of the gang continued throughout the morning as warriors tracked down and killed every member they could find. Some tried to flee into the desert, but the Quechan knew every hiding place and water source for miles around. Others attempted to barricade themselves in the ferry buildings, but these structures provided little protection against determined attackers who had no intention of allowing anyone to escape. By noon on April 23, 1850, the Glanton gang had been effectively destroyed as an organization. Nearly all of its core members lay dead at Yuma Crossing, their bodies scattered along the riverbank they had turned into a killing ground. The few survivors who managed to escape would never again pose a significant threat. lacking both the leadership and resources necessary to reconstitute their criminal enterprise. The Quechan's victory was complete and decisive, but it came at a cost. The destruction of the gang would eventually bring military retaliation from American authorities, who viewed the attack as an assault on American citizens regardless of their criminal activities. This would lead to increased military presence in the region and further restrictions on native autonomy, demonstrating how the gang's evil had poisoned relationships even after their deaths. News of the massacres spread quickly throughout the southwestern territories, carried by the few survivors who had escaped and by travelers who discovered the aftermath. Initial reports were confused and often contradictory, with some accounts portraying the gang as innocent merchants attacked by savage Indians, while others recognized the killings as justified retaliation against notorious criminals. The immediate reaction in communities that had suffered under the gang's depredations was often one of relief mixed with apprehension. While many were glad to see the end of Glanton's reign of terror, they also feared that the destruction of the ferry operation would leave travelers more vulnerable to other dangers in the desert. The practical problem of crossing the Colorado River remained, even if the criminal enterprise that had controlled it was gone. Mexican authorities in Sonora and Chihuahua had mixed responses to the news. While they were pleased to see the end of the gang that had murdered so many of their citizens, they were also concerned about the implications of increased violence in the border region. The gang's destruction represented both justice and a potential escalation of conflicts that could affect trade and settlement in the area. American military officials faced a more complex situation. Regardless of the gang's criminal activities, they were technically American citizens killed by Native Americans on what was now American territory. Military doctrine and political pressure demanded some form of response, even if many officers privately acknowledged that the gang had brought their fate upon themselves through their own actions. The destruction of the Glanton gang at Yuma Crossing marked the end of one of the most notorious criminal enterprises in the history of the American frontier. Their systematic campaign of murder, scalp hunting, and terrorism had finally met its match in the organized resistance of a people who refused to tolerate their presence any longer. The swift and complete nature of their defeat demonstrated that even the most ruthless criminals could be brought to justice when their victims found the courage and means to fight back effectively. The legacy of their destruction would resonate throughout the southwestern territories for years to come, serving as both a warning to other potential criminals and a reminder of the complex dynamics that shaped life on the frontier. As 1850 dawned, the Glanton gang found themselves in an increasingly precarious position along the Colorado River at the Yuma Crossing. Their seizure of Lincoln's ferry operation had transformed them from roving scalp hunters into stationary extortionists, but this change in tactics would prove to be their fatal miscalculation. The ferry crossing was not just a business opportunity. It was the lifeline connecting California's gold fields to the rest of America, and the gang's predatory control of this vital passage would inevitably provoke a response from forces far more organized and determined than the scattered Apache bands they had previously terrorized. The Quechan tribe, known then as the Yuma Indians, had inhabited the Colorado River crossing for centuries before European contact. They understood the strategic importance of this location better than any newcomer, having developed sophisticated systems for managing river crossings and maintaining relationships with travelers passing through their territory. When Lincoln first established his ferry operation, he had done so with the explicit permission and cooperation of the Quechan leadership, paying tributes and maintaining respectful relations that benefited both parties. The arrival of Glanton and his cutthroats shattered this delicate arrangement and set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in one of the most decisive acts of frontier justice in American history. Chief Caballo N. Pelo, whose name meant horsehair, led the Quechan during this turbulent period. Unlike the scattered Apache bands that had fallen victim to the gang's predations, the Quechan were a unified people with established territory, sophisticated political structures, and extensive networks of alliance with neighboring tribes. They had observed the gang's activities with growing alarm, not merely because of the violence against travelers, but because they recognized that Glanton's methods threatened the entire system of trade and diplomacy that had allowed their people to prosper at this crucial crossing point. The gang's treatment of Native Americans at the ferry crossing was particularly brutal, even by their own savage standards. They viewed the Quechan not as the legitimate inhabitants of the region, but as obstacles to their monopolistic control of river traffic. Samuel Chamberlain's account describes numerous incidents where gang members killed Quechan ferrymen who attempted to operate their traditional crossing services, often mutilating the bodies and leaving them displayed as warnings to others who might challenge their authority. These acts of terrorism were not random violence, but calculated intimidation designed to establish absolute control over all movement across the Colorado River. The economic impact of the gang's extortion was devastating for westward migration. Where Lincoln had charged reasonable fees that allowed ordinary families to afford passage, Glanton's operation demanded whatever the market would bear, often forcing travelers to surrender most of their remaining possessions simply to cross the river. Those who couldn't pay were frequently robbed, murdered, or forced to work as unpaid laborers at the crossing until they could somehow raise the required fees. This systematic exploitation created a bottleneck that slowed the California gold rush and generated complaints that reached authorities in both California and the territorial governments. Judge Holden's role during this period remained as mysterious and sinister as ever. According to Chamberlain's account, the judge had become increasingly philosophical about their crimes, viewing the ferry operation as a perfect laboratory for observing human behavior under extreme duress. He allegedly kept detailed notes on the psychological responses of victims, documenting how different types of travelers reacted to extortion, violence, and the threat of death. His enormous physical presence and unsettling demeanor made him particularly effective at intimidating ferry passengers into compliance. But his intellectual pretensions and casual discussions of murder horrified even hardened frontier travelers who encountered him. The gang's expansion beyond simple ferry operation into systematic murder of passengers represented their final descent into pure criminality. No longer content with extortionate fees, they began selecting wealthy-appearing travelers for robbery and murder, often targeting those returning from successful gold mining ventures who carried substantial amounts of cash and gold dust. These killings were conducted with ritualistic brutality that seemed designed as much for the gang's entertainment as for profit, with victims often tortured before being killed and their bodies disposed of in the Colorado River. The Quechan leadership's response to these escalating atrocities was measured but determined. Chief Caballo Impelo convened councils with neighboring tribal leaders, building a coalition that included not only his own people but also Mojave, Cocopah, and other Colorado River tribes who had been affected by the gang's depredations. This alliance represented a sophisticated diplomatic achievement, uniting traditionally independent groups around the common goal of eliminating the threat posed by Glanton's operation. The planning that followed demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking and organizational capability that would ultimately prove superior to the gang's chaotic violence. Throughout the winter and spring of 1850, the tribal coalition gathered intelligence on the gang's routines, strengths, and vulnerabilities. They observed the daily patterns of ferry operation, identified the locations where gang members were most exposed, and developed detailed knowledge of the compound's defenses and escape routes. This reconnaissance was conducted with such skill that the gang remained completely unaware of the systematic observation and planning taking place around them, confident in their superior firepower and convinced of their own invincibility. The psychological preparation for the assault was as important as the tactical planning. The Quechan and their allies understood that they were not merely attacking a group of criminals, but confronting a force that had terrorized the entire region and murdered countless innocent people. The ritualistic aspects of their preparation reflected both the spiritual significance they attached to this mission and their determination to ensure that justice would be both swift and complete. Warriors purified themselves through traditional ceremonies, and weapons were blessed by tribal spiritual leaders who declared the coming battle a sacred duty to protect their people and their land. As April 1850 approached, tensions at the ferry crossing had reached a breaking point. The gang's increasingly erratic behavior, fueled by alcohol and their sense of untouchable power, made them careless about security and contemptuous of potential threats. They had grown accustomed to intimidating individual travelers and small groups, but they failed to recognize the signs of organized resistance building around them. Their arrogance had blinded them to the reality that their reign of terror was about to face its ultimate test against an enemy far more formidable than any they had previously encountered. The final weeks before the attack saw an increase in seemingly routine interactions between tribal members and the gang, as Quechan warriors posing as traders and travelers gathered last-minute intelligence on gang positions and defenses. These reconnaissance missions required extraordinary courage, as discovery would have meant certain death, but they provided crucial information about the exact locations of gang members and the timing of their daily activities. The precision of this intelligence gathering would prove decisive in the swift and overwhelming nature of the assault that was to come. On the morning of April 23, 1850, everything appeared normal at the Yuma crossing. The gang members went about their usual routines of operating the ferry, extorting travelers, and planning their next criminal enterprises. They had no idea that this would be their final day of existence, that the systematic violence they had inflicted on others was about to be visited upon them with interest. The Colorado River continued its ancient flow toward the Gulf of California, indifferent to human schemes and violence, but by sunset it would carry the blood of some of the most notorious criminals in American frontier history toward the sea. The stage was set for a confrontation that would end not just the Glanton gang's criminal enterprise, but their lives, bringing a swift and violent conclusion to one of the darkest chapters in the history of the American Southwest. Looking around the Colorado River crossing in early April of 1850, Glanton and his remaining gang members must have felt invincible. They controlled one of the most lucrative choke points on the entire western frontier, extracting enormous sums from desperate gold seekers while systematically murdering those who carried the richest plunder. Their ferry operation at the Yuma crossing had become a perfect criminal enterprise, combining extortion with selective assassination in a location so remote that law enforcement was virtually non-existent. But John Glanton had made a fatal miscalculation. In his arrogance and bloodlust, he had underestimated the people whose land he had invaded and whose traditional way of life he was systematically destroying. The Quechan tribe, known then as the Yuma Indians, had been watching the escalating violence at their sacred crossing with growing anger and determination. What Glanton viewed as a business opportunity, they saw as a desecration of their ancestral territory and an intolerable threat to their survival. The Quechan had initially tolerated Lincoln's ferry operation because it brought trade opportunities, and because Lincoln had shown them basic respect. He paid them for the use of their land, employed some tribal members, and conducted his business without the wanton violence that characterized everything Glanton touched. But when the scalp hunters seized control of the crossing, everything changed. The murders, the robbery, the complete disregard for Quechan's sovereignty over their own territory, and most significantly, the destruction of a rival Quechan ferry downstream had pushed the tribe beyond the limits of tolerance. Chief Caballo Pelo, whose name meant horsehair, was a seasoned war leader who understood that the Glanton gang represented an existential threat not just to his people's economic interests, but to their very survival in the region. The gang's pattern of escalating violence, their willingness to kill anyone who crossed them, and their obvious contempt for Native American life made it clear that coexistence was impossible. The chief began planning what would become one of the most decisive and brutal acts of frontier justice in American history. The Quechan had several advantages that Glanton, in his racist arrogance, failed to appreciate. They knew every inch of the terrain around the crossing. They could move silently through areas the gang considered secure, and they had been observing the scalp hunters' routines and defenses for months. Most importantly, they were fighting for their homeland against invaders, which gave them a motivation and unity that the mercenary gang could never match. Throughout March and early April, Caballo Pelo carefully assembled a war party of approximately 50 warriors, selecting men known for their skill in combat and their absolute reliability. Unlike the diverse and fractious composition of Glanton's gang, the Quechan force was unified by shared culture, mutual trust, and a common purpose that transcended individual gain. They spent weeks conducting reconnaissance, learning the gang's schedules, identifying defensive weaknesses, and planning multiple escape routes for after the attack. The chief's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than launching a frontal assault against the gang's fortified position, he would wait for the perfect moment when the scalp hunters were divided and vulnerable. That moment came on the morning of April 23, 1850, when several gang members, including Glanton himself, had crossed to the Arizona side of the river to conduct business with newly arrived travelers. This left the main camp with reduced manpower and split the gang's leadership between two locations. Samuel Chamberlain, whose memoir provides the most detailed account of the gang's final hours, was fortunately absent from the crossing that morning, having been dispatched on a scouting mission several days earlier. His survival allowed him to later piece together the events from survivors and witnesses, creating the most complete record of what became known as the Yuma Massacre. According to Chamberlain's reconstruction, the attack began at dawn when the Quechan warriors silently surrounded both the main camp on the California side and the smaller group with Glanton on the Arizona side. The timing was perfect. Most of the gang members were either still sleeping or engaged in their morning routines, completely unaware that dozens of armed warriors had moved into position around them during the pre-dawn hours. Chief Caballo and Pelo had given strict instructions that the attack should be swift, decisive, and complete. There would be no prisoners, no negotiations, and no mercy shown to men who had shown none to others. The Quechan had seen too much of the gang's brutality to have any illusions about the nature of the men they were facing. This was not merely a battle, but an execution, carried out by a people who had been pushed beyond the point of any compromise. The assault commenced with a coordinated war cry that echoed across the Colorado River, a sound that survivors later described as the most terrifying thing they had ever heard. From multiple directions simultaneously, Quechan warriors armed with traditional weapons and captured firearms burst into the gang's camps. The scalp hunters, caught completely off guard and separated from their weapons, were unable to mount any coherent defense. John Glanton himself, the man who had terrorized the borderlands for over a year and murdered hundreds of innocents, died within the first minutes of the attack. According to Quechan oral tradition later recorded by ethnographers, Chief Caballo and Pelo personally sought out the gang leader and killed him with a war club, crushing his skull in a single devastating blow. The irony was not lost on the warriors. The man who had made his fortune collecting scalps died with his own head split open, his brains scattered across the ground he had desecrated with so much innocent blood. The Judge Holden, that mysterious and terrifying figure who had served as Glanton's second-in-command, met an equally violent end. Multiple Quechan warriors converged on the giant albino, and despite his reputation for intelligence and cunning, he proved as mortal as any other man when faced with determined enemies fighting for their homeland. His massive body, riddled with arrows and club wounds, was found among the other corpses when investigators later examined the scene. The few gang members who managed to initially escape the surprise attack found themselves trapped in a carefully planned killing field. The Quechan had anticipated every possible escape route and positioned warriors to intercept fleeing scalp hunters. One by one, the men who had terrorized innocent civilians across two countries were hunted down and killed with the same ruthless efficiency they had once applied to their own victims. The systematic nature of the Quechan victory was remarkable. In less than 2 hours, they had completely annihilated one of the most feared criminal organizations in the American West. The ferry operation that had generated thousands of dollars in illegal profits was destroyed. The weapons and equipment that had enabled so much violence were captured or scattered, and the reign of terror that had paralyzed the borderlands was definitively ended. The aftermath of the attack revealed the true scale of the gang's criminal enterprise. Among the bodies and scattered belongings, the Quechan warriors discovered evidence of the scalp hunters' recent activities: fresh scalps, personal belongings taken from murdered travelers, and substantial amounts of gold and silver coins extracted from their victims. The recovery of these items provided grim confirmation of the gang's systematic robbery and murder of ferry passengers. News of the Yuma massacre spread rapidly throughout the frontier, carried by the few travelers who had witnessed the aftermath and the handful of gang associates who had been absent during the attack. The initial reaction among American settlers and officials was outrage at what they perceived as an unprovoked Indian attack on American citizens. Calls for military retaliation against the Quechan were immediate and widespread. However, as more details emerged about the Glanton gang's activities, public opinion began to shift. The discovery of evidence linking the gang to hundreds of murders, the testimony of survivors who described the systematic robbery and extortion at the ferry crossing, and the revelation of the gang's transition from Apache hunting to indiscriminate killing of Mexican and American civilians gradually transformed the narrative from one of Indian aggression to one of justified retaliation against criminals. The Mexican government's response was markedly different from the American reaction. Officials in Sonora and Chihuahua, who had been terrorized by the gang's activities and had placed bounties on their heads, expressed satisfaction at their destruction. The Quechan were quietly praised for accomplishing what Mexican military forces had been unable to achieve: the complete elimination of a criminal organization that had brought chaos and death to the borderlands. Chief Caballo and Pelo and his warriors had achieved something unprecedented in frontier history. They had successfully identified, planned, and executed the complete destruction of a major criminal enterprise without suffering significant casualties themselves. The tactical brilliance of their attack, combined with their perfect intelligence about the gang's vulnerabilities, resulted in one of the most one-sided victories in the violent history of the American West. The Glanton gang's reign of terror was over. The men who had murdered hundreds of innocents, who had perverted both religious bounty hunting and legitimate business into systematic criminal enterprises, who had brought shame to the concepts of both military service and entrepreneurship, were dead. Their bodies, scattered across the Colorado River crossing they had tried to control, provided mute testimony to the ultimate futility of their violence. The Quechan had demonstrated that even the most feared criminals were not beyond the reach of justice, even in the lawless frontier. Their swift and decisive action had eliminated a threat that government authorities on both sides of the border had proven unable or unwilling to address. In doing so, they had restored a measure of safety to the borderlands and ended one of the darkest chapters in the history of the American Southwest. The Yuma crossing, no longer under the control of murderous scalp hunters, would eventually return to its role as a legitimate transportation hub for westward migration. The Yuma crossing marked the beginning of the end for the Glanton gang. Their control of the Colorado River ferry had transformed them from nomadic scalp hunters into stationary extortionists, making them increasingly vulnerable to organized retaliation. The Quechan tribe, whose traditional crossing they had seized, began planning a coordinated response that would bring their reign of terror to a swift and violent conclusion. The Quechan, known to Americans as the Yuma Indians, were not the passive victims the gang had encountered elsewhere. They were a sophisticated tribal confederation with centuries of experience defending their territory along the Colorado River. Their leader, Chief Caballo and Pelo, understood that the Glanton gang represented an existential threat not just to their economic interests, but to their very survival as a people. The gang's pattern of escalating violence and their willingness to kill both Native Americans and Mexicans indiscriminately made clear that peaceful coexistence was impossible. Through the winter of 1849 and into early 1850, Chief Caballo and Pelo conducted what can only be described as a masterful intelligence operation. Quechan scouts observed the gang's routines, counted their weapons, mapped their defensive positions, and identified their weaknesses. They noted that the gang had grown complacent in their success, often leaving their weapons unattended while they slept off drinking binges. They observed that the gang's discipline had deteriorated under the influence of easy money and constant violence. The Quechan also established contact with Mexican authorities and American travelers who had been victimized by the gang. These communications revealed the full extent of local hatred for Glanton and his men. Mexican officials, still smarting from the gang's betrayal of their scalp hunting contracts, quietly indicated they would not interfere with any tribal action against the criminals. American immigrants who had been robbed and abused at the ferry crossing provided intelligence about the gang's numbers, weapons, and habits. What made the Quechan response particularly effective was their patience and strategic thinking. Rather than launching immediate revenge attacks, they waited for the optimal moment when the gang would be most vulnerable. They understood that a failed assault would only provoke even more brutal retaliation, potentially leading to the complete destruction of their people. The stakes could not have been higher. The opportunity came on April 23, 1850. The gang had been celebrating a particularly profitable few days at the ferry, during which they had robbed several groups of returning gold miners. Their success had made them careless, and they had consumed large quantities of alcohol throughout the previous evening. By dawn, most of the gang members were in various states of intoxication or unconsciousness, scattered around their camp with their weapons poorly secured. Chief Caballo and Pelo had positioned his warriors throughout the night, surrounding the gang's position with meticulous precision. The attack, when it came, was swift and devastating. The Quechan warriors struck simultaneously from multiple directions, catching the gang completely off guard. Those who managed to reach their weapons found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by opponents who knew the terrain intimately and had planned for every contingency. John Joel Glanton himself died in the opening moments of the attack. According to Quechan oral histories passed down through generations, he was struck down while attempting to rally his men, falling with a war club blow to the head that crushed his skull. His death marked the symbolic end of the gang's power, though the fighting continued for several more minutes as individual members attempted to escape or make final stands. The battle was a complete rout. Of the approximately 30 gang members present at the ferry, only 3 or 4 managed to escape into the desert. These survivors, including Samuel Chamberlain, if his account is to be believed, fled on foot across some of the most hostile terrain in North America. Most would not survive the journey, succumbing to thirst, exposure, or pursuit by Quechan tracking parties who hunted down the escapees over the following days. The Quechan victory was total and decisive. They not only eliminated the gang, but also recovered substantial amounts of gold and valuables that had been stolen from travelers. More importantly, they had demonstrated that organized resistance could defeat even the most ruthless criminal enterprises. The message sent across the frontier was clear. Systematic violence and terrorism would ultimately provoke organized retaliation. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true scope of the gang's crimes at the ferry crossing. Quechan warriors discovered multiple burial sites containing the remains of travelers who had been murdered for their possessions. Personal effects recovered from the gang's camp included jewelry, documents, and money belonging to dozens of victims. The evidence painted a picture of systematic robbery and murder that had been conducted with industrial efficiency. News of the gang's destruction spread rapidly throughout the Southwest and California. Newspapers from Los Angeles to San Francisco reported the event with satisfaction, viewing it as long overdue justice for crimes that had terrorized the region. The Sacramento Daily Union wrote, "The destruction of the Glanton gang removes a stain upon civilization that had festered too long in our territories." The Mexican authorities in Sonora officially thanked Chief Caballo and Pelo for eliminating criminals who had long evaded justice. This represented a remarkable diplomatic recognition of tribal sovereignty and the right of indigenous peoples to defend their territories against criminal invasion. The gesture helped establish precedents for cooperation between Mexican authorities and Native American tribes in maintaining order along the border. For the Quechan people, the victory restored their control over the vital Colorado River crossing and re-established their role as legitimate operators of ferry services for westward immigrants. They proved to be far more reliable and honest businessmen than the gang had been, charging fair rates and providing safe passage for thousands of travelers over the following years. Their success demonstrated that Native American communities could effectively compete in the expanding frontier economy when given the opportunity. The destruction of the Glanton gang marked the end of the scalp bounty era in northern Mexico. The Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua, having seen how the system had been corrupted by men like Glanton, gradually abandoned their bounty programs in favor of more conventional military approaches to dealing with Apache raids. The failure of the bounty system to achieve its intended goals, combined with the international embarrassment caused by the gang's crimes, led to a fundamental reassessment of Mexican frontier policy. The gang's demise also had profound implications for American expansion into the Southwest. Their crimes had demonstrated the dangers of unregulated violence on the frontier and the need for effective law enforcement in newly acquired territories. The territorial governments that emerged in Arizona and New Mexico incorporated lessons learned from the Glanton gang case, establishing more robust legal institutions and military presence to prevent similar criminal enterprises from taking root. Perhaps most significantly, the Quechan victory became a powerful symbol of indigenous resistance to criminal exploitation. At a time when Native American communities were under tremendous pressure from westward expansion, their decisive action against the Glanton gang demonstrated that organized, strategic resistance could achieve meaningful victories. The story was remembered and retold throughout Indian country as an example of how traditional leadership and warrior traditions could be effectively employed against new forms of threat. The battle at Yuma Crossing represented more than just the elimination of a criminal gang. It was a pivotal moment in the struggle for control of the American Southwest, marking the end of the era when small groups of violent men could operate with impunity across vast territories. The rule of law, however imperfect, began to assert itself more effectively in the wake of the gang's destruction. Today, the site of the Glanton gang's final defeat is remembered as a place where justice finally caught up with systematic evil. The Colorado River still flows past the location where John Joel Glanton met his end, carrying with it the waters that witnessed both the worst and best of human nature on the American frontier. The Quechan warriors, who had been observing the gang's operations for months, finally struck with devastating precision on the morning of April 23, 1850. What the Glanton gang had not anticipated was that their systematic violence and exploitation had created something far more dangerous than individual enemies. They had forged a unified coalition of indigenous resistance determined to end their reign of terror once and for all. The attack came at dawn when most of the gang members were still sleeping off another night of drinking and violence. Chief Caballo and Pelo had spent weeks coordinating with other tribal leaders, studying the gang's routines and identifying their vulnerabilities. The Quechan had observed that the gang's arrogance had made them complacent. They posted minimal guards, kept their weapons scattered, and had grown overconfident in their ability to intimidate anyone who opposed them. The assault was swift and merciless. Quechan warriors surrounded the ferry compound under cover of pre-dawn darkness, cutting off all escape routes before launching their coordinated attack. Within minutes, the camp erupted in chaos as war cries pierced the morning air, and arrows found their marks with deadly accuracy. John Joel Glanton himself was among the first to die, struck down as he stumbled from his quarters still half drunk and reaching for his weapons. The man who had terrorized the borderlands for years died without dignity, cut down like the countless innocents he had murdered in his quest for bounty money and twisted scientific knowledge. The battle was over almost before it began. The Quechan had planned meticulously, knowing that surprise and overwhelming force were essential to prevent any of the gang members from escaping to continue their crimes elsewhere. By the time the sun had fully risen over the Colorado River, 16 members of the Glanton gang lay dead, their bodies scattered across the ferry compound they had seized through violence and intimidation. Only a handful of gang members survived the attack, and those who did were forever changed by the experience. Samuel Chamberlain, the chronicler whose memoirs would preserve the gang's story for posterity, was among the survivors. His account of the attack describes it as divine retribution, a moment when the accumulated weight of the gang's crimes finally brought down the justice they had evaded for so long. The destruction of the Glanton gang at Yuma Crossing marked the end of one of the most systematically violent criminal enterprises in American frontier history. Their death was not mourned by anyone except perhaps their immediate families. And even then, many relatives had long since disowned the gang members for their horrific crimes. The immediate aftermath of the attack saw a power vacuum along the Colorado River that various groups attempted to fill. The Quechan resumed control of their traditional crossing, though they remained wary of future incursions by American settlers and prospectors. The Mexican government, which had placed bounties on the gang members' heads, officially celebrated their destruction while quietly worrying about what other violent enterprises might emerge to replace them. News of the gang's annihilation spread rapidly throughout the borderlands, carried by survivors, traders, and travelers who had witnessed the aftermath. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive among the civilian populations who had lived in terror of the gang's depredations. Mexican settlements that had been systematically targeted for scalp hunting held celebrations, while Native American tribes saw the gang's destruction as proof that sustained resistance could overcome even the most brutal oppression. The broader implications of the Glanton gang's destruction resonated far beyond the immediate borderlands. Their death marked a turning point in the relationship between organized criminal violence and indigenous resistance in the American Southwest. The Quechan's successful elimination of the gang demonstrated that Native American groups could effectively organize and execute complex military operations against well-armed opponents when sufficiently motivated and properly coordinated. For the Mexican government, the gang's destruction solved an immediate problem while highlighting the broader challenges of maintaining law and order in the remote northern territories. The scalp bounty programs that had initially attracted and empowered the Glanton gang were quietly discontinued, as officials recognized that such systems inevitably attracted the wrong kind of mercenaries and created more problems than they solved. The American government's response was more complex and conflicted. While federal officials were relieved to see the end of a criminal enterprise that had complicated diplomatic relations with Mexico and threatened the stability of westward expansion, they were also concerned about the precedent set by indigenous groups taking direct action against American citizens, even criminal ones. Military leaders in the region filed reports analyzing the tactical aspects of the Quechan attack, noting the effectiveness of their intelligence gathering, coordination, and execution. These reports would influence future military planning and contribute to a growing respect for Native American military capabilities among professional soldiers, even as political leaders continued to pursue policies of displacement and subjugation. The scientific and medical communities that had unknowingly benefited from the gang's crimes also faced a reckoning in the aftermath of their destruction. When the full extent of the gang's connections to medical schools and research institutions became known, it prompted the first serious discussions about ethical standards in anatomical research and the sourcing of specimens for medical education. The literary and cultural legacy of the Glanton gang's destruction proved to be as significant as its immediate practical effects. Samuel Chamberlain's memoir, with its vivid descriptions of both the gang's crimes and their ultimate fate, became one of the most widely read accounts of frontier violence in the 19th century. The story of their rise and fall captured the American imagination as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked violence and the inevitability of justice, even on the lawless frontier. Cormac McCarthy's later novelization of the gang's story in Blood Meridian would cement their place in American literature as symbols of the darkest aspects of westward expansion and manifest destiny. The novel's portrayal of their destruction as both inevitable and necessary reflected broader cultural anxieties about the moral costs of American territorial expansion and the violence that accompanied it. The religious and philosophical implications of the gang's story also resonated with contemporary audiences struggling to reconcile their Christian beliefs with the brutal realities of frontier life. Many saw the gang's destruction as divine justice, proof that God would not allow such systematic evil to continue indefinitely. Others viewed it as evidence of the moral complexity of frontier existence, where traditional concepts of law and justice often proved inadequate to address the scale of violence and chaos. The economic impact of the gang's destruction was felt throughout the borderlands as well. The illegal economy they had created through scalp hunting, body selling, and extortion collapsed with their deaths, forcing many who had become dependent on their activities to find new sources of income. Some turned to legitimate occupations, while others simply moved to different regions where similar opportunities for violence and exploitation still existed. The story of the Glanton gang's destruction also became a powerful symbol for indigenous rights movements in later decades. The Quechan's successful resistance against overwhelming odds inspired other Native American groups facing similar threats, while their tactical sophistication challenged stereotypes about indigenous military capabilities that had been used to justify policies of subjugation and displacement. Today, more than 170 years after their destruction at Yuma Crossing, the Glanton gang remains a potent symbol of both the darkest possibilities of human nature and the ultimate power of justice to prevail against even the most systematic evil. Their story serves as a reminder that violence, no matter how well organized or profitable, ultimately contains the seeds of its own destruction. The site of their final battle has become a place of historical significance, marked by monuments commemorating both the gang's victims and the courage of those who finally brought them to justice. Visitors to the area can still see remnants of the ferry operation and imagine the terror that once ruled this crucial crossing point between nations and territories. The Glanton gang's legacy continues to influence our understanding of frontier justice, organized crime, and the complex relationships between different cultural groups in the American Southwest. As the smoke from the burning ferry operations drifted across the Colorado River, John Glanton stood among the ashes of what had been his most profitable criminal enterprise. The year was 1850, and the notorious scalp hunter had finally pushed too far. The Quechan tribe, whose ancestral crossing he had commandeered and whose people he had murdered for sport, had reached their breaking point. What followed would be the violent end of one of the most brutal criminal organizations in American frontier history. The Quechan people, known to Americans as the Yuma Indians, had maintained control of the strategic Colorado River crossing for generations. This wasn't merely a business arrangement for them, but a sacred responsibility tied to their cultural identity and survival. The crossing represented one of the few reliable passages between California and the Eastern Territories, making it invaluable to westward migration and trade. When Glanton and his gang seized control of the ferry operation, they weren't just stealing a business venture, they were committing an act of cultural and economic warfare against an entire people. The Quechan had initially attempted to coexist with Glanton's operation, even as they witnessed the escalating violence and extortion that characterized his management style. Tribal leaders understood the political realities of the time's military forces. They had seen what happened to other tribes who resisted American expansion too openly. The Apache, despite their fierce resistance, were being systematically hunted and killed by men exactly like Glanton. However, the Quechan's patience had limits. Glanton's decision to destroy their competing ferry operation and murder several tribal members in the process crossed a line that could not be ignored. In Quechan culture, the protection of their people and their sacred sites took precedence over political expedience. The river crossing wasn't just economically important, it was spiritually significant, connected to creation stories and ancestral traditions that stretched back countless generations. Chief Caballo and Palo, whose name meant horsehair, emerged as the leader of the resistance against Glanton's occupation. Unlike many frontier conflicts where Native American perspectives were rarely recorded, the Quechan resistance was documented by several sources, including Mexican officials and American travelers who witnessed the events. Chief Caballo and Palo was described as a man of considerable intelligence and strategic thinking, who understood that defeating Glanton would require careful planning rather than simple force. The chief's strategy was multifaceted. First, he gathered intelligence about Glanton's operations, learning the gang's routines, their weapons, their numbers, and most importantly, their weaknesses. The Quechan had observed that Glanton's men were often drunk, particularly in the evenings after a day of extorting travelers. They noted that the gang's discipline was poor, with members frequently fighting among themselves over the division of profits. Most crucially, they recognized that Glanton's men were overconfident, believing their reputation for violence made them invulnerable to attack. Second, Chief Caballo and Palo carefully built a coalition that extended beyond his immediate tribe. The Quechan had trading relationships with other Native American groups in the region, and many of these tribes had their own grievances against Glanton's gang. The scalp hunters had attacked peaceful villages, murdered innocent people, and disrupted traditional trade routes throughout the Southwest. By early 1850, Glanton had created a network of enemies that Chief Caballo and Pello could potentially mobilize. The chief also understood the importance of timing. A direct assault on the ferry when it was heavily defended would likely result in massive casualties among his people, even if they ultimately succeeded. Instead, he waited for the right moment when Glanton's forces would be divided and vulnerable. That moment came in April 1850, when several gang members departed the ferry site to conduct raids in the surrounding area, leaving the main camp with reduced defenses. On the night of April 22, 1850, Chief Caballo and Pello put his plan into action. The attack was coordinated with precision that surprised even experienced frontier observers. Rather than a single frontal assault, the Quechan launched simultaneous attacks on multiple positions. One group targeted the ferry itself, preventing escape by water. Another group surrounded the main camp where Glanton and his remaining followers were sleeping. A third group positioned themselves along the likely escape routes, ensuring that any survivors would be intercepted before they could reach safety. The attack began in the pre-dawn hours when the gang's vigilance was at its lowest. Samuel Chamberlain, whose memoir provides the most detailed account of the gang's activities, was not present during the final assault, having left the group several months earlier. However, his account includes descriptions based on testimony from Mexican officials and American travelers who investigated the aftermath. The Quechan warriors moved with the stealth and coordination that comes from intimate knowledge of terrain and careful preparation. They had studied Glanton's camp for weeks, noting the positions of sentries, the location of weapons caches, and the sleeping arrangements of the gang members. When the attack began, it was swift and devastating. John Glanton, the man who had terrorized the borderlands for years, was reportedly killed in the first minutes of the assault. According to multiple accounts, he was struck down while attempting to rally his men. His body found the next morning with multiple wounds from traditional Quechan weapons. The poetic justice of his death was not lost on contemporary observers. A man who had made his fortune through scalping and systematic murder had been killed by warriors defending their homeland and their people. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. Glanton's remaining followers, caught completely off guard and lacking their leader's brutal charisma, offered little organized resistance. Some attempted to flee across the desert, but the Quechan had anticipated this and positioned warriors along the escape routes. Others tried to fight their way to the river, but found their boats destroyed or heavily guarded. Dr. Lincoln, the ferry's original owner who had been driven out by Glanton months earlier, was reportedly spared by the Quechan warriors. This selective targeting demonstrates the sophisticated understanding the tribe had of the situation. They distinguished between Glanton's criminal organization and other Americans, suggesting that their attack was specifically directed at the gang rather than representing broader anti-American sentiment. The aftermath of the attack revealed the full extent of Glanton's criminal enterprise. When Mexican authorities and American investigators arrived at the scene several days later, they discovered evidence of systematic murder, robbery, and torture that went far beyond what had been previously documented. The gang's camp contained personal effects from dozens of victims, including items that could be traced to specific individuals who had disappeared while crossing the river. Most disturbing was the discovery of detailed records that Glanton had kept of his crimes. These documents, apparently maintained for his own satisfaction rather than any practical purpose, provided a chilling insight into the methodical nature of his violence. The records included descriptions of murders, tallies of stolen goods, and notes about which types of travelers were most likely to be carrying valuable items. The Quechan victory had immediate and far-reaching consequences. News of Glanton's death spread rapidly throughout the Southwest, carried by traders, military personnel, and government officials. The reaction was complex and revealing of the moral contradictions inherent in frontier society. While Glanton's crimes were well documented and widely known, his death at the hands of Native Americans created complicated political dynamics. Some American officials and settlers viewed the Quechan attack as an act of war that demanded retaliation, regardless of Glanton's criminal activities. This perspective reflected the racial attitudes of the time, where violence by white Americans against Native Americans was often excused or ignored, while Native American violence against whites was treated as an existential threat requiring massive response. However, other voices, particularly among Mexican officials and more thoughtful American observers, recognized the Quechan action as legitimate defense of their territory and people. These commentators noted that Glanton's gang had operated entirely outside the law, that they had committed crimes against both Mexican and American citizens, and that official authorities had failed to take action against them despite numerous complaints. The Mexican government's response was particularly telling. Rather than condemning the Quechan attack, officials in Sonora and Chihuahua quietly expressed satisfaction that the gang had been eliminated. Governor Angel Trias Alvarez of Chihuahua, who had placed bounties on Glanton's head after discovering the gang was scalping Mexican citizens, reportedly stated that justice had been served, regardless of who had administered it. For the Quechan people, the victory was both triumphant and costly. They had successfully defended their territory and eliminated a serious threat to their safety and sovereignty. Chief Caballo N. Pelo had demonstrated that Native American resistance could be effective when properly organized and strategically implemented. The successful attack also sent a message to other potential criminals that the Quechan crossing was not to be seized without consequences. However, the tribe also understood that their victory might invite retaliation from American authorities. The complex political situation of 1850, with California's recent admission to the Union and ongoing debates about territorial governance, made their position precarious. They had struck a blow for justice, but they had also killed American citizens, regardless of those citizens' criminal activities. The Quechan response to this dilemma demonstrated remarkable political sophistication. Rather than simply celebrating their victory and waiting for potential retaliation, tribal leaders immediately began diplomatic efforts to explain their actions and justify their response. They sent emissaries to Mexican officials, emphasizing that their attack had been specifically targeted at criminals who had been terrorizing the region. More significantly, they also reached out to legitimate American authorities, including military commanders and territorial officials. Their message was carefully crafted. They had not attacked Americans because they were Americans, but because specific individuals had committed crimes against the Quechan people and had been operating outside the law. They emphasized their desire to maintain peaceful relations with lawful American settlers and officials. This diplomatic strategy proved remarkably effective. While some American officials initially demanded military action against the Quechan, cooler heads ultimately prevailed. Investigations into Glanton's activities revealed the full extent of his crimes, making it politically difficult to justify retaliation against the tribe that had eliminated him. The discovery of evidence linking Glanton to murders of American citizens, including returning California gold miners, actually strengthened the Quechan position. The broader implications of Glanton's defeat extended far beyond the immediate participants. His death marked the end of the scalp hunting era in the American Southwest. While individual bounty hunters continued to operate for several more years, the systematic, organized scalp hunting that had characterized the 1840s largely disappeared. The failure of the bounty system to distinguish between hostile and peaceful Native Americans had led to exactly the kind of organized resistance that officials had feared. The Glanton gang's destruction also influenced American policy toward Native American tribes in the Southwest. The recognition that excessive violence and criminality could provoke effective resistance led to more careful consideration of how territorial expansion should be managed. While American expansion continued, the methods became somewhat more regulated, with greater attention paid to distinguishing between legitimate military operations and criminal enterprises disguised as frontier justice. For the broader American public, Glanton's story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated violence on the frontier. Newspaper accounts of his crimes and his eventual fate were widely read throughout the country, contributing to national discussions about law, order, and justice in the Western Territories. The story reinforced the importance of legitimate governmental authority and the rule of the law, even in remote frontier regions. The literary legacy of the Glanton Gang, particularly as immortalized in Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, has ensured that their story continues to resonate with contemporary audiences. McCarthy's novel, while fictionalized, captures the essential horror of their enterprise and the moral questions it raises about violence, civilization, and human nature. The character of Judge Holden, whether based on historical fact or literary imagination, has become an iconic representation of intellectual evil and the corruption of knowledge in service of violence. Modern historians have used the Glanton Gang case to examine broader questions about frontier society, racial relations, and the development of legal institutions in the American West. Their story illustrates how the absence of effective governmental authority can create spaces where criminal enterprises can flourish, and how such enterprises inevitably generate the resistance that destroys them. The Kushan people's successful resistance to Glanton's occupation has been recognized as an important example of Native American agency and strategic thinking in the face of American expansion. Rather than being passive victims of frontier violence, the Kushan demonstrated their ability to analyze complex situations, develop effective strategies, and execute coordinated military operations that achieved their objectives. Chief Cabalo Npelo's leadership during this period has been studied as an example of how traditional Native American political structures could adapt to the challenges of American expansion. His ability to build coalitions, gather intelligence, and coordinate diplomatic efforts alongside military action demonstrated the sophistication of indigenous political systems that American officials often dismissed as primitive. The environmental and geographic factors that contributed to the Glanton Gang's rise and fall have also been examined by historians interested in the relationship between landscape and human behavior. The remote nature of the Colorado River crossing, combined with the absence of effective law enforcement, created conditions that allowed criminal enterprises to flourish. However, the same geographic isolation that protected the gang also made them vulnerable to coordinated attack by people with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Economic historians have analyzed the Glanton Gang's operations as an example of how market incentives can produce perverse outcomes when not properly regulated. The scalp bounty system created financial incentives for violence that quickly spiraled beyond any reasonable bounds. The gang's diversification into ferry operations, robbery, and extortion demonstrated how criminal enterprises adapt to changing market conditions and seek new sources of profit. The psychological dimensions of the Glanton Gang's crimes have been studied by researchers interested in group dynamics and the normalization of violence. How did a diverse group of men from different backgrounds come to accept and participate in systematic murder and torture? The process of gradual escalation, combined with the isolation of frontier life and the corrupting influence of easy profits, created conditions where extreme violence became normalized within the group. The role of leadership in criminal organizations has been examined through the example of John Glanton himself. His ability to maintain control over a diverse and violent group of followers, his strategic thinking in developing new criminal enterprises, and his ultimate failure to anticipate the resistance his actions would generate provide insights into the psychology of criminal leadership. As we reflect on the complete story of the Glanton Gang, from their formation through their violent end, several key themes emerge that remain relevant today. The corruption of legitimate authority, the dangers of unregulated violence, the importance of distinguishing between military necessity and criminal opportunism, and the inevitability of resistance to systematic oppression all find expression in their story. The Glanton Gang represented the darkest possibilities of American frontier expansion. They demonstrated how the absence of effective legal institutions, combined with racial prejudice and economic incentives for violence, could create conditions where systematic atrocity became not only possible, but profitable. Their story serves as a reminder of the importance of maintaining moral and legal constraints on violence, even in the most challenging circumstances. Yet their story also demonstrates the resilience of human dignity and the power of organized resistance to injustice. The Quechan people's successful defense of their homeland shows that even in the face of overwhelming violence and technological disadvantage, strategic thinking and coordinated action can achieve justice. Chief Cabalo Impelo and his warriors proved that the arc of history, while long, does indeed bend toward justice when people are willing to fight for it. The final chapter of the Glanton Gang saga reminds us that evil, no matter how powerful or well-organized, contains the seeds of its own destruction. Their crimes were so extreme, their violence so indiscriminate, and their arrogance so complete that they inevitably created the conditions for their own downfall. In seeking to terrorize and control through violence, they united their enemies and provided the motivation for the very resistance that would destroy them. On that April morning in 1850, as the sun rose over the Colorado River and revealed the scattered remains of John Glanton's criminal empire, a chapter of American frontier history came to a violent but fitting close. The scalp hunter who had made his fortune through systematic murder lay dead in the desert, killed by warriors defending their homeland. The gang that had terrorized the borderlands for years was no more, destroyed by the courage and strategic brilliance of people they had dismissed as inferior. The story of the Glanton Gang serves as both historical record and moral lesson. It reminds us of the capacity for evil that exists within human nature, but also of the power of justice and the inevitability of resistance to systematic oppression. In the end, their legacy is not one of successful criminality, but of the ultimate failure of violence divorced from morality, law, and human decency. The Colorado River continued to flow past the Yuma crossing, carrying away the blood and debris of that final battle. New ferries would be built, new travelers would cross, and the westward expansion of America would continue. But it would do so with the knowledge that even on the lawless frontier, there were limits to what civilized society would tolerate, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, would ultimately prevail.